We have trust issues. Not you and I per se, but we as Americans, people generally, broadly speaking in the world these days, we've got trust issues. Trust in institutions, religious ones among them, at an all-time low. Trust in politicians, probably deservedly so, at an all-time low. But even trust in doctors and teachers and nurses and some otherwise trustworthy professions, it's down. This is research that's been done for years and years and years on end now, polling people about trustworthy professions and trust in institutions. Pew does some of this research. We keep sliding toward a certain kind of distrust. Perhaps you felt it. Perhaps you felt distrust in some institutions or some otherwise trustworthy professions. Some of you work in spaces or inhabit spaces wherein a certain level of trust is expected. And then your motives or your expertise or your effort is put into question. The tendency for the one representing mistrust, we'll say, or for the person who is suddenly not trusted, tendency is to start to ramp up toward mutual defensiveness and anger sometimes, and heightened suspicion about the motivations of the other person. It's not doubt that leads us to that place, though. That's a pretty important place to start with our conversation today. It's not the intellectual offering of skepticism that leads us into a place where we suddenly don't trust our doctor or the school teacher anymore, or leads us to growing defensiveness and anger and suspicion. There's something happening at the emotional level, at the level of the heart, not the head. Doubt as a feeling, an increased feeling of distrust or suspicion. That's where we seem to be having our difficulties. There are a lot of good ways of reviewing the research on the way that our brains work with regard to thought processes and emotions. A good overview is the book Thinking Fast and Slow. It's at the top of my list this week because of the Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who wrote that book, I think 13 years ago or so now, just died about 2 weeks ago. There are other good books as well on the topic. The idea is this: our brains have two processing modes. One is fast. Typically, we feel it before we think anything about it. Our emotions can be leveraged by that part of our brain, so to speak. This is all kind of a metaphor, to get us to a place where we act. And we don't have to ponder, we can just move. This is a pretty good thing when you need to flee, right? Or if you need to stand and fight. You don't want to have deep philosophical conversations with yourself about whether or not to run. Here is a lion. I'm going to go that way. Just go. And you have everything that you need to make the decision and go. But sometimes that gets the better of us. And the right thing to do is to slow down and stop. And we have another way of processing where we do have this contemplation, and we can process around complex thoughts. And these two are in partnership with one another. An automatic mode and a manual mode, they are sometimes called. And both are subject to bias. Neither one of them is perfect. But sometimes they don't work in partnership. And the automatic brain takes over and can hold us in its grip. And when we are in the grip of this automatic mode, trust can devolve quickly. You, I think, have probably been there before. I know I have. Sitting as a parable for me is a story that I can't remember if I've told you before about the hospitalization of my second child, Clara. If I've told you this before, my apologies. I beg your forgiveness. I'll try not to do it again. But it's a parable for me, so I'm going to keep on coming back to it the same way we do other parables. Clara, my second-born child, was born with what we now know was an accessory suture line. In the soft spot of the head, there's normally some kind of fissure, right? And then eventually that will coalesce into the skull. Some kids are born with more than one of those lines. Clara was one of those kids. She also ended up developing early on in her life a hematoma, big, juicy bruise. We didn't know where it came from, and we were already scared when we took her to the hospital. It was a Friday night. Unfortunately, it was Friday night. It was not Friday morning. That would have been great because the pediatrician team would have been there. Nope. We got the adult radiology department who went in quickly, took an x-ray, had never seen a skull that had been fractured quite like this one has. Oh, and then all hell broke loose. Mr. Sloan, what did you do to your child? Mrs. Sloan, what did you do to your child? Your child's skull has been fractured. What happened? The ensuing days were hellacious. DFACs, of course, involved, separated from one another and interrogated separately. DFACs going to our apartment to get our older daughter out of bed and interview her. It was a hard weekend. We were in the grip of fear, not only fear about the health of our child, but about everything else in our lives. And in the grip of that fear, that fast brain kicking in overdrive, the slower brain taking a nap for the weekend, in the grip of all of that, trust eroded quickly. Every person, every institution, everyone who had ever been involved in the child of our care was now under suspicion from each one of us. Even our own abilities as parents. Did I do something? I don't remember doing anything, but listen, we're sleep deprived. Maybe something happened. Did I do something? I don't even trust myself anymore. Trust was gone. Now again, at the end of that story, the pediatric radiation or radiology team came in on Monday morning and said, accessory suture line, no big deal. Off we went, discharged really quickly. So the story ended just fine. But the pain, the mistrust, the fear and panic, that grip held on. The disciples, including our brother Thomas, were caught in the grip of their fast brains in the week following Jesus' death. The Bible describes them as being afraid, sure. But imagine all the other emotions that they're processing. Grief and sadness and anger, I'm sure, as well, all wrapped up and holding them in its grip. Trust, no doubt, was at an all-time low. As Christ had done so frequently, Christ did then to offer his presence and his peace to those whom he loved. And so he appeared to some of the disciples to bring them the gift of his Spirit and a peace which the world cannot give. But poor Thomas was not with them. He was held in the grip of fear a little longer. And look how it eroded his trust in those closest to him. You've heard it said before, no doubt, from this pulpit. I believe I've said it every Sunday following Easter from this pulpit, and I know others have before me. Thomas was no doubter. A courageous and faithful disciple throughout the gospel. Even here, he wasn't doubting the identity or person of Jesus. He was not trusting those closest to him. He was not otherwise given over to the slow brain's skepticism. But here he became, as many of us do and many of us are, unwilling to trust the testimony or the motives or the experience of those other beloved disciples. And then we can imagine, because we've been there, the reaction of the disciples. Perhaps they too began to be defensive or even angry. Thomas, what's wrong with you? Haven't we walked all this way together? It's striking to me that when Jesus arrives, he doesn't address any of this head on. He doesn't come in and say, Thomas, why didn't you just believe them? What's wrong with you? And he doesn't come in and say, friends, you should stop being so defensive. Instead, he offers what is needed most, his presence and his peace. Not only to help Thomas to believe, sure, but also to offer that which was lacking in their community, the community that was becoming the church. So within the church, before any apologies could be given, before the defenses could be acknowledged or named, before explanations are given, Jesus invites the disciples to share in his presence and in his peace. It's from that place of peace that Thomas will then be able to offer the strongest affirmation in the entirety of the Gospels of who Jesus is, my Lord and my God. It's from their shared sense of peace that the church will begin to offer the ministry of Christ in the world. I send you as I myself was sent, Jesus says to them. You will carry on to do the work that's been given originally to me. Throughout this season of Easter, the next several weeks, we'll head toward Pentecost, and we'll remember one particular version of the story where the Spirit of God comes to the church with power about 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus. And we will sometimes say that's the birthplace of the church. This is the moment the church became the church. I'm not entirely sure that's theologically accurate. It's definitely not accurate from the perspective of the Gospel of John. Because right here, even now, on the Sunday of the resurrection and the Sunday following, Jesus is showing up to create a foundation of his presence and his peace so that they can continue in ministry. And he breathes on them and gives them the Spirit as the continuous offering of that presence. With Christ's presence and Christ's peace, the community of faith is made new. Continuously. For 2,000 years since, the renewal of the church is predicated upon Christ's presence and Christ's peace. Now, we get into these traps every now and then because we'll say, oh no, the renewal of the church is dependent upon my intellect, our power, your good ministry, and the resolving of our doubts or our conflicts or our suspicions. Jesus says, no, none of that. We don't have to acknowledge that first. Maybe we have to get there. But the renewal of the church will happen as it approaches my presence and my peace. Now, we could use a little bit of that in our world right now. While I'm convinced that the society at large will continue to slide toward distrust, the church is perpetually invited to renew itself, to draw closer to the presence and peace of Christ. It's what we long for, that we might be so rooted in that peace that the world cannot give, a peace which passes all understanding, right? That we could be so rooted there that it changes how we operate out there. We become agents and ambassadors of that peace, of that presence. That's what the church does. And sometimes we need to be reminded that the invitation is in front of us to be renewed. There are many stories of the church receiving that invitation again and holding on to it. We've already heard the story of Thomas. You don't really need another story, so I'll skip the story part. I'll just remind you that in the book of Acts and throughout the rest of the New Testament, there's this constant tension happening between the church built on the very ministry and presence and peace of Christ and the church that messes it up just about every other page. Because we're people, and it's going to happen. The door was open to return to the peace and presence of Christ. Paul's letters can be summed up in that way. Hey, y'all, it looks like you might have messed it up again, but Jesus is with you. And so be rooted and grounded in his presence and in his peace. Today, I want to close by offering you the words that he wrote to the church in Colossae, the Colossians. Read these words as a prayer for us as well. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. The peace to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, and singing together psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts. Let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts. That peace to which indeed we have been called in one body. And let us be thankful.